Thanks, Dana. Happy Boxer Day.
Thank you.
This is a Fox News alert. Amid a partial government shutdown, President Trump and the First Lady make a surprise visit to troops serving in Iraq. This as stocks have another record day on Wall Street, closing more than 1,000 points higher. Good evening. I'm Brett Baer. The trip was a first for the president, who has been heavily criticized for not visiting the region, and was announced in true Trump administration style with a tweet late this afternoon by his press secretary that included a photo of the president and the First Lady posing with U.S. troops. While on the ground in Iraq, the president thanked the men and women for their service and said he has no plans on removing them from Iraq at any time. This time, despite abruptly announcing last week that he was pulling troops out of Syria. We have Fox team coverage tonight. Pentagon producer Lucas Tomlinson with more on the progress being made in the fight against ISIS. But we begin with correspondent Ellison Barber from the North Lawn of the White House. Good evening, Ellison.
Good evening, Brett. The president is on his way back from his unannounced trip to Iraq. He is set to make a second stop at an undisclosed location before returning here to the White House. Under the cover of darkness, the president and First Lady boarded Air Force One and made their way to Iraq west of Baghdad. They spent roughly 3 hours on the ground visiting with troops stationed at Al-Assad Air Base. President Trump gave a 20-minute speech to cheering troops.
We came to Al-Assad to share our eternal gratitude for everything you do to keep America safe, strong, and free.
This is the president's first visit to a combat zone since taking office. And it comes on the heels of his decision to draw down troops in Afghanistan and Syria. Mr. Trump said he wants U.S. soldiers to come home from Syria, that other countries like Turkey need to share the burden of cost, that the U.S. cannot be the world's policeman. But if needed, Iraq can still be used as a base to stage attacks on Islamic State militants. Despite past criticisms of the war in Iraq and calling President George W. Bush's decision to invade in 2003 the single worst decision ever made, President Trump told reporters he has no plans at all to withdraw troops from the country that is still considered a combat zone.
I have concerns for the First Lady, I will tell you. But if you would have seen what we had to go through with the darkened plane with all windows closed, with no lights on whatsoever, anywhere. Pitch black, I've never seen it. I've been in many airplanes, all types and shapes and sizes. I've never seen anything like it. We're coming in and I know all of the things that were surrounding us for safety. So did I have a concern? Yeah, I had a concern. But my bigger concern was maybe the people that were with me.
Back home, roughly a quarter of the U.S. government remains shut down. The president promising the government will not open until he has funding for a physical barrier at the U.S.-Mexico border.
Whatever it takes. I mean, we're going to have a wall. We're going to have safety. We need safety for our country. When you say how long is it going to take, when are they going to say that we need border security? When are the Democrats going to say? Don't forget, the Democrats all agreed that you need a wall until I wanted it. Once I wanted it, they didn't agree.
When speaking with reporters about the shutdown and workers impacted, administration officials here at the White House often like to remind us that the last pay period ended on December 22nd, and those paychecks will go home on December 28th. But the White House also says it is very likely that this shutdown will continue into the new year. Hundreds of thousands of federal workers are expected to be impacted. Congress returns tomorrow. Brett?
Ellison, thank you. As Ellison reported, the president is touting success in the fight against ISIS. Lucas Tomlinson joins us now from the Pentagon with a look at what the president believes is the dwindling dominance by the terror group. Good evening, Lucas.
Good evening, Brett. More than 5,000 U.S. troops are currently deployed to Iraq and include Special Operations Forces. Those troops are used to train and advise local Iraqi forces and could be used against ISIS in the future. President Trump says, though, the terror group isn't as threatening as they once were.
2 years ago, when I became president, they were a very dominant group. They were very dominant. Today, they're not so dominant anymore.
Since the president announced all 2,000 troops would be leaving Syria, the Pentagon says more than 30 airstrikes have been launched in eastern Syria, killing hundreds of ISIS fighters. More evidence the terrorist army isn't quite defeated. U.S. officials warn ISIS and its ideology have spread to other continents, including Europe and Africa, where terror attacks have been launched in recent days. In Iraq, not all U.S. troops are training local forces. U.S. artillery on Iraq's border with Syria has been shelling ISIS positions around the clock in eastern Syria. The last known ISIS stronghold is the city of Hajin, located within range of these cannons. At its height in 2014, ISIS controlled an area the size of Ohio. During President Trump's first year in office, airstrikes against the terror group increased 33%. Roughly 40,000 bombs were dropped on ISIS last year. This year, airstrikes have been sharply reduced as fewer ISIS targets remain on the battlefield. Today, ISIS only holds 1% of the territory it once held in Iraq and Syria. Despite the gains against ISIS, the security situation in Iraq remains tense. One of the reasons the president's visit remains secret, and the president and first lady only spent a few hours on the ground at a U.S.-controlled air base west of Baghdad in the middle of the night. The president spoke to Iraq's new prime minister over the phone. Security situations prevented a face-to-face meeting, but President Trump hopes his Iraqi counterpart can visit the White House early next year. Outgoing Defense Secretary Jim Mattis did not make the trip to Iraq. President Trump says he's in no hurry to find a replacement. Mattis's deputy Patrick Shanahan takes over next week as acting Defense Secretary. Brett.
Lucas Tomlinson, live at the Pentagon. Lucas, thanks. Another Fox News alert now. Talk about a comeback. The markets roared back with another record day, the Dow posting its best day in nearly a decade after having its worst Christmas Eve Monday. The Dow closed up 1,086 points. The S&P 500 finished ahead 117. The Nasdaq was up 361. For more on the stunning turn on Wall Street, we turn to Susan Lee of the Fox Business Network. Good evening, Susan. What sparked all this?
That's what you call volatility, Brett. Yeah, an emphatic bounce back with the biggest single-day points gain ever for the Dow and the best day for the Nasdaq and the S&P 500 since March 2009. Markets coming back from the brink, close to ending the longest bull market run in history. Investors were out bargain hunting, relieved by signs that the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell is staying put.
You made it very clear that Secretary Mnuchin's job is safe. Is the Fed chairman's job safe?
Yes, of course, 100%. Yes.
100%. The Fed chairman's job is not in jeopardy by this president.
Absolutely. That's correct, yes.
Retailers like Amazon, Target, Kohl's, and Macy's leading the rally today after the best holiday shopping period in 6 years, according to MasterCard, with Americans spending over $850 billion from November to Christmas. And the strong retail trend confirmed by Amazon's own results. The largest U.S. online retailer saying it was a record-breaking holiday shopping period with more items ordered worldwide this year than ever before. Consumer spending crucial to the U.S. economy, powering over 2/3 of it, and highlights a disconnect between Main Street confidence and Wall Street jitters. Oil prices also lifting sentiment, rallying the most in 2 years, with investors rethinking their fears of a sharp global economic slowdown. Now, most economists are forecasting moderating economic U.S. growth in 2019, but few are predicting an actual recession, only a 1 in 6 chance, according to the Federal Reserve. The central bank, meantime, is still forecasting the best year of economic growth in 13 this year, the last time the U.S. grew at 3%, and only a slight drop to over 2% next year. Not exactly recessionary. Brett?
More on this with the panel. Susan, thank you. There's good news and bad news for travelers this holiday season. First, the good news. Gas prices have been steadily falling since October and continue to drop. On Christmas Eve, across the nation, the national average was $2.32 per gallon, according to AAA. And in many places, prices dipped below the $2 mark. However, with the cheaper gas comes a lot more people out and about. This is the bad news. AAA forecasts more than 112.5 million Americans will travel over the holidays, so traffic is definitely up. Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen is calling the death of a young Guatemalan boy in U.S. custody a tragedy and is taking extra steps to check on the health of illegal immigrant children in U.S. care. National correspondent William Lachinesse reports on what officials say happened and how the administration is handling it.
Following the death Christmas Eve of an 8-year-old boy, customs officials today asked the Centers for Disease Control to investigate the symptoms of sick migrants crossing the border.
Our job is to try to identify any children that need medical care and get them to a hospital as quickly as we can, and we're doing that.
Commissioner Kevin McAleenan provided this timeline in the death of Felipe Gomez. Agents apprehended the boy and his father south of El Paso December 18th. December 20th, they were moved to the El Paso station. December 23rd, transferred again because of overcrowding to a station in Alamogordo, New Mexico. December 24th, an agent noticed the boy looked sick and took him to the hospital. Admitted at 9:30, he tested negative for strep throat, but with a 103-degree fever, doctors prescribed an antibiotic and ibuprofen. Discharged at 2:50, he arrived at a highway checkpoint holding cell at 5 p.m. 2 hours later, he began vomiting, returning to the hospital at 11. He lost consciousness during transport and was pronounced dead just shy of midnight.
People need to understand they're coming from a third world country. A lot of these people have never seen a doctor. They come in bad shape.
In a conference call, officials defended agents overseeing Gomez.
It was the emergency room doctors and nurses who made the decision to discharge the young boy.
That explanation likely won't go far on Capitol Hill, where some in Congress are already investigating.
I want to make sure that we put the well-being and welfare of those kids before we put any other concern.
Well, several lawmakers want the Border Patrol to review their pediatric screening procedures and the release of any child 72 hours after apprehension. Secretary Nielsen said a review is underway, while also sending more EMTs to the border to handle the arrest of 1,500 women, children, and families each day. Brett?
William, thank you. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is out of the hospital and recovering at home. A court spokeswoman says Ginsburg left a New York hospital on Christmas Day. The 85-year-old underwent surgery Friday to remove 2 malignant growths in her left lung. Despite her health problems, Ginsburg has never missed arguments. Court resumes January 7th. New leads in the search for the body of a missing Colorado mother who police now believe was murdered by her fiancé around Thanksgiving. Correspondent Claudia Cowan with the latest on this investigation.
Authorities in Colorado and now Twin Falls, Idaho, working with the FBI, confirming they have new evidence in what has become a murder investigation.
While we have not found Kelsey at this time, information has been developed that is helping to narrow down our search. As you can tell from the arrest, sadly, we do not believe Kelsey is still alive.
Refusing to detail the new evidence, investigators confirm it was found in Idaho, near where Barrett's cell phone pinged after she vanished on Thanksgiving, some 800 miles from her home outside Colorado Springs. Barrett's alleged killer, her fiancé and father of her 1-year-old daughter. 32-year-old Patrick Frazee faces charges of first-degree murder and solicitation of murder. Today on America's Newsroom, Fox News legal analyst Mercedes Colwin said investigators are honing in on whoever else was involved.
They do hope that someone's going to trip up, someone that's being accused, that they'll trip up eventually. They'll trip up in who they talk to. They'll get a consciousness will sort of rise up and they'll make an admission of some sort.
This surveillance video shows the 29-year-old mom at a grocery store near her home on Thanksgiving Day. She was shopping with her daughter hours before dropping the child off with Frazee, who allegedly killed Barrett in her home.
We finally received enough information to implicate Patrick in his involvement in Kelsey's death, which we were able to present to a judge, and a judge was able to sign off on the first-degree murder charge.
Hours after Frazee was arrested on Friday, mourners gathered at Barrett's hometown church in Moses Lake, Washington, many signing condolence cards for her family and praying for justice. Patrick Frazee is being held without bond at the Teller County Jail. He'll be formally arraigned on Monday and could enter a plea at that time. Brett?
Claudia, thank you. Up next, the changing face of American families. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 2 in San Francisco, where outgoing Governor Jerry Brown granted clemency to 35 people in the Bay Area. The move was part of 143 pardons and 131 commutations throughout the state, granting a certificate of rehabilitation for some and cutting down jail and prison sentences for others. Fox 29 in Philadelphia, where GoFundMe says it has refunded everyone who contributed to a campaign prosecutors claim was a scheme orchestrated by a homeless veteran from the city and a New Jersey couple. The alleged scam raised more than $400,000, which police say was then spent on luxury items and casino trips. And this is a live look at New York from our affiliate Fox 5. One of the big stories there tonight is the bump in pay for minimum wage workers in New York City. This New Year's Eve, base pay for workers is going up around the state. The highest wages will be in New York City, where many employees will see their minimum hourly pay go up to $15 an hour. The move makes New York City, Seattle, and San Francisco major American cities to have hit that benchmark. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back. Authorities in Indonesia are urging people to avoid coastal areas where a tsunami killed at least 430 people over the weekend. The warning was issued on the anniversary of the catastrophic 2004 earthquake and tsunami that killed 230,000 people across Asia. Beaches were largely empty in the area struck by Saturday's tsunami, although some residents defied that warning. As we head into 2019, you may look back and think about how much has changed, not just in the past year, but in your life. And it's not just you. America's population, our culture, it is all changing. In the first of our three-part series, correspondent Doug McElway looks at how the changes could affect everything from the U.S. economy to politics.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
A few months after President Kennedy preached about civic duty, Virginia Senator Harry F. Byrd found the new president was practicing something else. Byrd analyzed 25 of JFK's first communications to Congress and found 175 requests for increased government spending. 58 years later, $21 trillion in debt, and saddled with expensive entitlements, the U.S. is facing a demographic crisis that JFK could not have imagined. Fertility rate of 1.8%. That means the U.S. is not producing enough to sustain its population.
We do see fertility rates going down, not just here in this country, but in much of Western Europe, other parts of the world. And that becomes a problem when you're relying upon younger generations to pay for many of the social programs of older generations, of which there are now more people.
The reason behind these demographic changes are complicated.
One of the reasons people have fewer children is because they're unsure about the future. They're unsure about the costs of raising those children, especially the cost of education, and the student loan debt is a huge crisis that everybody knows about.
In her book, Men on Strike, forensic psychologist Helen Smith argues that young men's resistance to marriage is a rational response to today's culture.
Men have gone on strike because they feel like the incentives are just not there for them anymore. The risks of marriage and a lot of things for men today are very high, and the rewards for men are very low.
Others argue declining fertility rates are the result of women's success, their choices to pursue careers earlier, bear children later, oftentimes on their own, without husbands or biological fathers.
Women are in a position today to be able to educate their own children, pay for the medical care, house their children, shelter them. There is not as much of a need for them to have a partner.
At the other end of the economic spectrum, many poor single mothers rely heavily on government as provider. In Kennedy's time, such dependence may have been shunned. Today, many embrace it.
We saw that in the Obama administration with the life of Julia. And at each stage, there was the government to provide assistance with children or assistance with housing or assistance with education.
The U.S. is compensating for lower fertility rates with another demographic change, an increased reliance on immigration.
On the case of the right, they want people to work cheaply, more cheaply than in native-born citizens. And on the left, they want a further argument or an agenda for big government.
These demographic changes help to partly explain the resurgence of socialism in the United States. A Gallup poll from August found that young adult Americans are more positive about socialism, 51%, than they are about capitalism, 45%. That's a 12-point swing in only 2 years. Brett?
Doug, thanks. Part 2 tomorrow. Up next, an old foe with a new threat to our airlines. First, beyond our borders tonight. The government of Japan announced today that it is leaving the International Whaling Commission to resume commercial hunts for the animals for the first time in 30 years. The government says the whale population has recovered enough to warrant resuming the commercial hunts, but the Japanese did say they would no longer go to the Antarctic for hunts which have been heavily criticized by conservationists. Tunisian authorities say 18 people have been arrested during protests following the death of a journalist who set himself on fire to protest economic problems in the North African nation. The journalist posted a video online calling for a revolt over unemployment and what he saw as unfulfilled promises of Tunisia's 2011 Arab Spring revolution. And nearly a dozen people were injured in Italy after an earthquake that was triggered by a volcanic eruption from Mount Etna. Homes and churches were also damaged in eastern Sicily when the earthquake struck before dawn today. Just some of the other stories beyond our borders tonight. We'll be right back. Our top story at the bottom of the hour, President Trump visits U.S. troops in Iraq. During his trip, the president praised the battle being won against ISIS. But as correspondent Jillian Turner reports, an old foe is promising a new threat.
American and British intelligence officials are ringing alarm bells about an uptick in terrorist threats against airlines and airports around the world.
Terrorists are going to continue to target us, so we've got to keep targeting them during the holiday season and all year round.
Much of the U.S. government's attention has been focused on ISIS over the past 4 years, since its inception in 2014.
We're destroying the bloodthirsty killers known as ISIS. We've done a very, very major job on ISIS. We have defeated ISIS.
But intelligence shows that al-Qaeda has been alive and well and making inroads into vulnerable regions.
We've seen linkages from al-Qaeda in West Africa to al-Qaeda in Syria to al-Qaeda in South Asia. So in my judgment, they are trying to regain relevance.
Al-Qaeda is looking to make a comeback and reassert itself as the world's most high-profile terrorist group. It's been hit hard by the U.S.-led coalition's ground wars inside Iraq and Syria. Their manpower in those countries has been decimated over the past several years. So instead, the group's turned its attention to aviation attacks. Officials say first up on al-Qaeda's agenda is developing new technologies to take down passenger jets, including bomb-carrying drones, miniaturized bombs, new chemicals, and new explosion methods. Terrorism experts tell Fox News al-Qaeda's also focused on infiltrating airports. They're planning to get more jihadist operatives hired as airport employees, giving them access to flight and passenger info and planes.
We don't have any illusion about what their intent is.
European intel chiefs say they're worried that President Trump's decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria will embolden al-Qaeda and other terror groups to up the ante in the Middle East. The White House is also worried about increasing terrorism in the friendly skies, and they've been working on this issue behind the scenes for months. National security officials will soon release a national strategy for aviation security, the first for the Trump administration and the first aviation plan in 10 years. The strategy itself is classified, but an unclassified version will be released publicly. Brett?
Jillian, thank you. Israel's military is not backing down in Syria, launching airstrikes overnight in that country. The move comes after the Trump administration announced the U.S. was pulling troops out of Syria. Correspondent Trey Yingst reports tonight from Jerusalem on what Russia is calling a provocative act by Israel.
Christmas Day, the sky was clear and quiet over the Syrian capital of Damascus. And then, at nightfall, explosions. A series of Israeli airstrikes were conducted overnight on Iranian targets, Western intelligence sources confirmed to Fox News.
We are not prepared to accept the Iranian military entrenchment in Syria, which is directed against us. We will act against it vigorously and continuously, including during the current period.
In response to the strikes, a volley of anti-aircraft missiles were fired towards the attacking planes. One entering Israeli airspace and triggering an air defense system in central Israel, according to the Israeli Defense Force. Sources add that Russia was notified ahead of the strikes to avoid collision. In September, Syrian anti-aircraft missiles attempted to shoot down an Israeli fighter jet, leading to a Russian military aircraft being shot down. Now the Russian Defense Ministry says Syrian air defenses destroyed 14 of the 16 missiles fired on the Syrian capital last night. Russia also claiming the Israelis used 2 civilian planes as cover to launch the assault. Tuesday's action was the first by Israel since the Trump administration's decision to pull U.S. troops out of Syria.
President Trump's decision to withdraw the American soldiers from Syria will not change our policy. We are standing steadfast on our red lines in Syria and everywhere else.
When asked earlier this month by Fox News whether or not Israel would attack Iran within its own territory, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu did not rule it out. Brett?
Trey Yangst in Jerusalem. Trey, thanks. Amid a partial government shutdown, President Trump takes a surprise trip to see U.S. troops in Iraq. Our panel on the optics of this unannounced visit and all the day's news next.
Discussing strategy, we're discussing lots of things, including even nearby Syria. It's a place that I've been talking about for many years, and many years before it started. I was talking about it as a civilian. Many of you know what my feelings were, and I wanted to come and see Iraq. I wanted to come and pay my respects, most importantly, to the great soldiers, the great troopers that we have here.
President Trump and the First Lady landing in Iraq, and the news came via, as many things in the administration do, via tweet. Sarah Sanders tweeting out, President Trump and the First Lady traveling to Iraq late on Christmas night to visit with our troops and senior military leadership to thank them for their service, their success, and their sacrifice, and to wish them a Merry Christmas. A lot of pictures of them on the ground in Iraq. This, of course, as many news organizations went with this story, NBC, Trump becomes first president since 2002 not to visit troops at Christmas time. Newsweek, Trump is first president in 15 years to not visit troops during Christmas period. Daily Beast, a similar headline, this coming out as Air Force One was landing at El Asad Air Base in Iraq. So let's start there with our panel. Mark Thiessen, he's a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Karen Tumulty, opinion writer for The Washington Post. And Tom Bevan, Real Clear Politics co-founder and president. Mark, you know the importance of presidents visiting troops in the field in this context, especially after all that has happened after the Syria announcement. What about this day?
It's a great day, and look, give all credit to the president for making the trip, all credit to him for taking the First Lady, which is a historic first, and I'm sure our troops really appreciate having her along as well and getting a chance to meet her. And it's always, this is the president's first trip to a combat zone since he took office, and it's really important to do that because you get a chance to, President Bush always said, I need the advice, and I kind of deferred to my commanders on the ground. Well, now he had a chance to sit down today with the commanders on the ground, and what I'm sure, and I hope he listened to them, because what I'm sure those commanders on the ground told him is that ISIS is not defeated. It's true the president is right when he says we've knocked the hell out of them, but they are not defeated, and he had to knock the hell out of them because of the precipitous withdrawal that his predecessor Barack Obama made. They had about 700 adherents when Barack Obama pulled out, and they turned into tens of thousands and took over a territory the size of Ohio in Syria and Iraq. Right now, according to our military, they have about 30,000 fighters. They have lost their physical caliphate, and President Trump deserves great credit for removing their physical caliphate, but what they've done is they've reverted into a classic insurgency, and according to our military, ISIS is as powerful today as they were before the surge in 2007. So they are not defeated yet, and we have a lot of work to do before they are.
Karen?
Yeah, I think it was a great thing that he went, and I'm sure the troops very much appreciated it. And certainly after Christmas Eve with the more than a dozen tweets, it was interesting. He was relatively disciplined for Donald Trump. I think the only thing that really marred it was when he kind of went into campaign rally mode at one point, where he brought in his fights with the Democrats and those sorts of things. Those are really not sort of the kind of rhetoric that we are used to seeing out of a president in this kind of setting, this sort of partisan sparring, taking it past our shores.
Yeah, he also said that he's not pulling U.S. troops out of Iraq, which I'm sure is a welcome news for the Iraqi prime minister, who's still dealing with issues in his country. About that Iraq commitment, take a listen to two former officials.
I think the president's trying to communicate that he is on top of the national security decisions that he's been faulted for recently, certainly for the Syria decision, and it's good to see that he's also on top of Iraq.
I think the fact that the president has demonstrated a commitment to Iraq is really important because we still have a lot of work to do there, both on the domestic political scene as well as ridding Iraq of those terrorists which are seeking to do them and us harm.
You know, and Tom, the security was extremely tight. They had some kind of thought that there was a breach heading over, that they were being tracked, Air Force One, as it landed in Al-Assad Air Base, and I think that might have tightened things even further. They did not meet one-on-one with the Iraqi Prime Minister on the ground. There was a phone call, but just being there and saying that the U.S. troops were staying is probably a relief to the Iraqis.
I'm sure it is, and also, I mean, I think it shows Trump. Look, to Mark's point, I mean, there has been some discussion about whether this is a wise move or not. It's certainly the pullout of troops from Syria. It certainly was something that Trump talked about a lot, campaigned on, wanted to do, and he's finally doing it. But I think there's also reassurance that, you know, Trump's not going to be shy if ISIS rears its head using the troops and Iraq as a base to go back and you know, knock the heck out of him, as Trump would say. So I think he absolutely is going to be committed to the fight against ISIS.
All right, let's turn now to the shutdown and where we are in this standoff. Here is the president on Tuesday and also his top economic advisors.
I can't tell you when the government's going to be open. I can tell you it's not going to be open until we have a wall, a fence, whatever they'd like to call it. I think they understand what's happening. They want border security. The people of this country want border security. You know, it's not a question of me. I'd rather not be doing shutdowns.
They might miss a pay period because the government's shut down, but in the end, even if they aren't working, then Congress has decided to pay people for the whole time. And so in the end, it's really just a sort of short-term problem, not a long-term problem for government workers.
Mark, I mean, there seems to be backbone here on the president's part, and the word from Capitol Hill is that he is not going to back down unless there's significant movement on the wall or border security or a fence or whatever you want to call it.
I agree. Look, I think actually time is on the president's side in this shutdown fight, and here's why. Nancy Pelosi today made some snarky comment about how his concrete wall has become a beaded wall. That's a sign that the Democrats are not negotiating and they're not taking it seriously. The president, on the other hand, has put, Mick Mulvaney was on Fox News Sunday, and he said that they've made an counteroffer to the Democrats for a lower price tag. Fox News has been reporting that it's $2.1 billion. So the president is trying to compromise and come to an agreement, and the Democrats are making snarky jokes and thinking they have him on the run and not engaging. For the short term, he owns the shutdown because he claimed the mantle of the shutdown. He said, I want to shut down the government over border security. But over time, if he seems to be the one, Americans want compromise on this. If he's the one who's compromising and the Democrats are demanding absolute surrender, then it's going to backfire on them because that's not what the American people want. And over time, as he keeps making, if he can be responsible and keep making concrete offers that are concessions to the Democrats, then over time they will start to own the mantle of the shutdown. So I think he's right to stick to his guns and be reasonable and make reasonable offers.
Yeah, and Karen, we put up the pie chart often about this particular shutdown and what has been funded and what is still really in doubt here, whether it gets a deal, and that is 25%. It affects the not yet enacted bills in the spending bills. That's still a lot of people potentially who are affected, as it could last into the new year.
And this idea this is just a short-term impact and, you know, that they will all get their back pay, the fact is for these government workers, their mortgage payments still come due, their credit card payments still come due. So a lot of these people are living paycheck to paycheck. And also there are a lot of federal workers, people who work for the government who are contractors, who clean the buildings, who really are paid on an hourly basis. And those people will not be getting back pay. So for the people who are affected, and yes, it is, you know, a small piece of that pie chart, but to say that these are temporary effects and that it's like, you know, no big deal as long as you get your back pay is simply not true for people who do live paycheck to paycheck.
Right, and to that point, what if the shutdown continues into the new year? This is an official talking about that, Kevin Haslett.
shutdown lasts longer than December, then all that back pay that people would get for the weeks in December would come in January, and so that would have a slight negative effect on GDP in the fourth quarter and a positive effect on GDP in the first quarter.
Tom, I guess I just don't see, it's kind of rolling off of them. And if that's the case, then eventually this negotiation is going to go the other way.
Yeah, we'll see how it plays out. I mean, right now, this is sort of like the first quarter of this thing, and it's not really, people are on holiday. They're going to be on holiday through the first of the year, but after the first of the year, pressure is going to get ratcheted up. Democrats are going to come back. Nancy Pelosi is going to put a bill in the House on January 3rd to reopen the government, and then they're going to put the pressure on Trump. Why won't you sign this? Why won't you do this? Now, there won't be any border funding in that, and that's when the fight's really going to heat up, and we're going to see who's got the leverage and where the pressure points are, and whether Mark's scenario plays out, whether Trump can flip this on them and say, listen, I'm negotiating in good faith. You guys are not negotiating at all, so now it's your shutdown. But it is going to get serious in about a week.
All right, panel, stand by. Next up, the roller coaster ride on Wall Street. Today, a huge day. Would have led any newscast except for the trip to Iraq. Where is the U.S. economy headed? Next.